what what are we seeing with Bitcoin now as a currency versus an investment vehicle? With this story, we're talking about where you can spend it, what you can do with it, but in practice, it's not seen as much of a currency at this point, right?
Yeah, that's right. There was this early narrative in Bitcoin's history where people did think that this was a currency. And the primary reason why people thought that is because barely anyone was using Bitcoin, and so there was low fees, and it felt like a new payment structure. However, what we're seeing now is that most people in the West are treating Bitcoin like a financial asset. They're using it as either a hedge for the rampant inflation we're seeing, or just a speculation or an investment on future technology. However, if you look abroad, it's a very different story. In developing nations, most people don't actually have a bank account. And so in those places, a mobile phone is their primary source of technology, and you can implement Bitcoin on your mobile phone. So it's essentially a bank account in your pocket, and no one can stop you from using it. And in those places, they actually use Bitcoin for payments quite frequently, especially in Africa, where there's over 2,000 payment networks. And this is something us in the West have a little privilege over, and we don't really notice this, I would say, by and large. And so in those countries, they're doing cross-border payments with Bitcoin's Lightning Network, which is actually a payment network that lives on top of Bitcoin, similar to how Visa is used with our dollars today.
And you were saying before we started that a lot of countries don't have their own currency, and Bitcoin is kind of being adopted as almost kind of a quasi-currency for them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the best case study right now is El Salvador. Roughly 1.5 months ago, their president turned Bitcoin into legal tender. And so what we've seen in 20 days is over 3 million El Salvadorians adopting Bitcoin. And it took 20 years to get only about half that on their banking system. And so in those countries, again, without their own currency, they see Bitcoin as an opportunity to rise above and try to get to the next level technologically.
And so, I mean, when Ryan and I were talking before, we both kind of came to the example that maybe the average person would understand is it's almost kind of like gold. You know, like it has a value. You could use it to buy something,
Yep.
but it's more of a anti-inflation, or a hedge against inflation, and a way to store value. And that's kind of what Bitcoin has become right now.
Yeah, that's right. I think the main thing that people use it for is to store their value into the future. I think comparing it to gold makes the most intuitive sense for people. We understand gold is limited in supply, right? Gold supply inflation is only about 2% each year for the last 50 years, so it's relatively stable. And that looks really good in times of high inflation, which we're experiencing right now. And actually, our own Fed president here, Neel Kashkari, recently said on 60 Minutes that we can print an infinite number of dollars. And that scared a lot of investors because high inflation causes issues in the market. And what we're seeing is investors turn to hard assets like Bitcoin as a way to protect their value, protect the fruits of their labor in an asset that can't be inflated. And of course, Bitcoin's famous for having only 21 million total units. There'll never be any more.
Sure. And so, I guess one thing like I'm wondering is with this story, Ryan and a few other owners have told me kind of some of the hurdles that are there to use it as a currency from a customer standpoint and as an owner. I guess what do you think all needs to kind of change before Bitcoin is truly used as a currency?
Yeah, when we look at payments or using Bitcoin as a currency, it's actually very easy to set up technologically, right? It's accepted all over, but what we're finding interesting is not very many people are wanting to spend their Bitcoin. And there's two primary reasons for that. Number one, Bitcoin's the best performing asset in the history of time. It's gone up over 230% annually since its inception 12 years ago. So point one is investors expect a return. And so why would they want to spend the money that's going up in value when it's, at least in the West here, it's very easy to spend our dollars. So that's number one. Number two is the IRS treats it as property. And so what that means is anytime you spend Bitcoin, that's technically you selling Bitcoin, which is a capital gains tax. And so it gives the spender a financial headache to account for all these transactions, and also they have to pay 20 to, let's say, 40% of that transaction to the IRS. And so, what will happen in the future? I would say that as Bitcoin becomes, let's say, $50 to $100 trillion asset, which is where I see some sort of an equilibrium point to be, and at that point, investors might see only 5% annual returns or something like that. So in that environment, investors would be much more willing to part with their Bitcoin. And at that point, maybe the IRS will change the tax implications on Bitcoin so it's not so much of a burden. However, I would caution people to think that that's crucial. Bitcoin never needs to be an everyday currency in the West. We have modern banking systems and good tools, and Bitcoin can, grow 100x from here and never be used for commerce. And that's because people will store it, use it to store their value, similar to gold, similar to real estate, stocks, bonds, etc.